Welcome to another new episode. Like always, today we are here with an exciting topic that will boot your knowledge. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the main discussion.
Hey everyone, today we're diving into an explainer that connects a terrifying historical mystery straight to a really alarming modern forecast. We're going to unpack a massive event from 1877. This was a year where the ocean did something so strange and honestly so violent that it triggered one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters in all of human history. And the reason we're talking about this today? Well, because right now researchers are watching almost the exact same warning signs flash red all over again for 2026.
50 million. I want you to just sit with that number for a second. That is the staggering death toll from this 19th century weather event. To put that scale into perspective, that's essentially the entire modern population of South Korea, just vanishing over the course of a few years. And they didn't disappear because of a war, and it wasn't some sweeping plague. They literally died because of the weather. Now, in our modern world with satellites and fully stocked supermarkets and cargo planes, you'd probably think, we're completely safe from something like that today. But as we'll see, the truth is actually a whole lot messier.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at history's deadliest weather disaster. 2. The machine behind El Niño. 3. The Great Drought of 1877. 4. How policies created a famine. 5. Warning signs for 2026. And finally, number 6. Are we ready today?
Okay, let's jump into part 1. History's deadliest weather disaster. Now, right off the bat, it's really crucial to understand that this 1877 event isn't some exaggerated myth. This is hard, heavily researched scientific fact. But you might be wondering, how do we actually know what happened without modern satellites? Well, researchers essentially treated this like a giant climate cold case. They pieced the whole disaster together using some incredibly creative methods. They dug into the detailed logs of 19th century ship captains who were obsessively recording ocean temperatures. They looked at tree rings, which basically act as natural rain gauges, right? Growing thicker in wet years and thinner in dry ones. They even analyzed coral samples pulled straight from the ocean floor. By weaving all these scattered clues together, scientists were able to prove just how immense and terrifying this historical anomaly really was.
Moving on to part 2, the machine behind El Niño. To really grasp how a disaster like this unfolds, I want you to picture the Pacific Ocean as a giant stretched-out bathtub. Let's walk through how this ocean seesaw actually works. So, step 1. Under normal conditions, you've got this steady wind blowing west across our giant bathtub, pushing the surface water toward Asia. Step 2, all that nice warm water pools up over on the western side. But then step 3 hits. Something knocks that loop off balance. Say, a trio of really unusual cyclones forming near the equator. When that happens, those steady trade winds suddenly weaken, or they might even reverse entirely. And that leads to step 4. It's literally like turning off a giant fan. All that warm water that was piled up, it just comes sloshing and sliding right back east towards South America.
And that massive slosh of warm water, that's what we call El Niño. When this gigantic pool of heat shifts over to the eastern Pacific, it totally upends the atmosphere above it. It acts like a roadblock, nudging the jet stream, that fast-moving river of air that steers our global storms, completely off its normal path. So the big takeaway here is that this is never just a localized ocean warming event. It literally yanks rainfall away from the regions that desperately depend on it, essentially shutting off the water supply for entire continents that are thousands of miles away.
Which brings us to part 3, the Great Drought of 1877.
So when this massive global rewiring kicked off in the 1870s, it didn't just pass quickly. It held on relentlessly across 2 back-to-back monsoon seasons. Look at this number, a 3.5 degrees Celsius spike above normal. In this specific patch of ocean that scientists track, the temperature has just rocketed up. Even by our modern standards, that makes the 1877 to 1878 event the absolute strongest El Niño ever measured. A temperature shift of that magnitude doesn't just, tweak the weather. It completely short-circuits it, triggering a synchronized global drought.
And the results were a planet-wide catastrophe. Let's look at the toll. In India alone, somewhere between 6 and 10 million people died. Over northern China, a resulting famine wiped out up to 13 million people. There were actually provinces there that saw half their entire population either die or flee. In northeastern Brazil, hundreds of thousands died under a scorching drought. When you tally it all up, the total global death toll was anywhere from 30 to 60 million people. That was roughly 3 to 4% of the entire human race at the time, completely wiped out in just a couple of years. It remains the deadliest climate event of the modern era.
All right, part 4. How policies created a famine.
Now we get to the real twist of this explainer, because the brutal truth is, the weather alone didn't kill 50 million people. Human empires did. In British India, the colonial government was strictly following a laissez-faire economic theory. So even as millions of people were actively starving in the streets, the government continued collecting taxes and literally exporting grain onto ships for profit. If you wanted famine relief, you had to go to a camp and perform grueling manual labor for rations that were barely enough to keep you alive. Amazingly, at the very height of the famine, they even threw this massive, extravagant ceremony in Delhi just to celebrate the queen's new title. Meanwhile, over in Qing Dynasty China, the system was just fractured. They had endured decades of internal wars which had completely drained the state's emergency grain storehouses and treasuries. So when the drought slammed into this already weakened system, there was absolutely zero reserve capacity. In both of these cases, it was human systems that actively turned a natural drought into a devastating, man-made famine.
And the disaster had even darker ripple effects halfway across the world. Down in southern Africa, this massive drought dried up all the grazing lands, which completely collapsed the Zulu kingdom's cattle economy. British colonial forces saw this happening and actively exploited that exact moment of chaos and economic desperation. They issued an impossible ultimatum and used it to launch a colonial war. The systems that were set up in the aftermath of that conflict echoed forward for generations, eventually paving the way for formalized segregation in the region.
So yes, the weather was extreme. There's absolutely no denying that. But as you can clearly see, it was the specific choices made by people in power, the glaring lack of preparation, and these rigid economic systems that turned a severe environmental shock into a mass casualty event unlike anything the world had ever seen. Disaster, as it turns out, is always a combination of nature and human infrastructure.
Which brings us to Part 5, Warning Signs for 2026. This is where we have to pivot the narrative to our present day, because climate researchers right now are making some incredibly unsettling comparisons. Looking at the data for April 2026, those unusual cyclones we talked about earlier, storms with names like Mila, Vanu, and a super typhoon named Sinlaku, they lined up and actually reversed the Pacific winds, just like turning off the fan on our bathtub, right? By July, the ocean had already warmed past 2 degrees Celsius, totally blowing past expectations and rivaling the buildup we saw before the highly destructive 1997 El Niño. And the forecast for late 2026? Multiple independent climate models are currently giving it a 3 in 4 chance of becoming the single strongest El Niño ever measured. It is directly mirroring the exact buildup we saw in 1877.
Finally, Part 6. Are we ready today? Which brings us to the absolute most important question. If we're facing a weather event of this historic magnitude, is our modern world actually immune to it? Well, let's start with the good news. Thanks to incredible modern infrastructure, early warning satellites, global shipping networks, and dedicated international aid organizations, global deaths from starvation have actually dropped by roughly 90% over the last century. Mass famines on the scale of 1877 have become almost unthinkable, all because of generations of patient, steady investment in global safety nets.
But here's the alarming modern twist. Right as this historic climate shock approaches, those very safety nets are being actively dismantled. Deep cuts to international aid funding project a truly devastating outcome, an estimated 14 million additional deaths worldwide by 2030, and tragically that includes 4.5 million children. So we are essentially tearing a massive hole right through the middle of our global safety net at the exact moment a potentially historic El Niño is brewing out in the Pacific.
Let's break down the specific regions that are sitting directly in the crosshairs right now. South and Southeast Asia are facing the threat of weakened or delayed monsoons, which, remember, is exactly what doomed the harvests back in 1877. Southern Africa and the Horn of Africa are extremely vulnerable. You have fragile food systems and active conflicts colliding head-on with the threat of severe drought. And then over in the Eastern Pacific, places like Peru and Ecuador face the exact opposite threat. All that warm water piling up brings unusually heavy rainfall and catastrophic flooding. These regions simply have the least room for error as this event unfolds.
And that leaves us right here with a question we all need to seriously consider. As we sit and watch the early stages of a potentially historic climate event unfolding real time, the final outcome might come down just as much to budget meetings and aid funding today as it does to the actual temperature of the Pacific Ocean. So I'll leave you with this thought. If an 1877 scale disaster truly unfolded today, would our modern interconnected systems actually hold up under the pressure? Or, when push comes to shove, are we far more fragile than we like to admit?
How did you like today's discussion? If you have any questions about this topic, don't forget to let me know in the comment. Stay well, stay healthy.